Hello, today we're going to end our unit on decision making. We'll be talking about the role of the individual. As you remember, one of our economic schools of thought, neoliberalism, puts a lot of faith in individual decision makers. Um, the idea is that individuals are rational beings, and if they see a threat like climate change that's they acknowledge as being real, they will act through individual decisions to hold off catastrophic climate change by reducing their carbon footprint and doing other things that will help stave off runaway climate change. So we're going to look at that today from a very critical perspective. And really, this is a topic that could spend more than a semester on. So we're just going to scratch the surface, but you can make up your own mind, but I'm going to present a rather skeptical point of view as to why individual decision making is not enough. With regards to individual decision making, neoliberals think that we are all free to vote in the marketplace with our dollars. So if we believe that climate change is real, then we're free as individuals to not fly, like Greta Thunberg has refused to fly in airplanes. We can buy electric cars. We can buy homes near public transit lines so we don't even need a car. We can invest in energy efficient homes. We can put solar panels on our roof. These are the types of actions that a neoliberal would say that individual could take to help reduce the risk of climate change. So in this neoliberal world, change happens by people voting with their dollars in the marketplace. And we're going to explore a little bit again why it's unlikely that collective action by individuals without policy is unlikely to create a more sustainable society. So a few things and again, this list could be even much longer about why I think there's room for skepticism about individual action saving us. One is that individuals tend to have this propensity to discount the future, and that has become amplified by consumer culture. The idea that anything that counts is happening in the short term, and we don't put too much stock in the long term. Look at how tribalism in some places, especially in the United States, is really increasing as part of our search for identity, and we'll be talking about that, and how political interests like professional campaigners have been hijacking tribalism and taking advantage of our search for identity. Also, collective action often requires a strong sense of community, and again, especially in the United States, what we've been seeing over the past half century is a weakened sense of community. Talk about the rise of social media. This is not only a huge distraction, but it is also an enormous time sink. Young people used to be the most important agents of change in our society. Today, young people are in this enormous time suck where they often don't have time to commit to participating actively and especially not to be leaders. Rising insecurity, we'll explore how this makes it difficult for people to think again of collective needs like protecting the environment. We'll look at growing materialism and its role also again in distracting people. And finally, we'll look at a new threat, big data and the rise of persuasion architectures can steer us away from truth towards the propaganda that powerful groups want us to believe. Powerful groups within our country and maybe even without from other parts of the world can steer how we think. So we'll explore persuasion architectures at the end of the lecture. So the first thing I want to start out with, and few people ever think about this, is where do we get our identity from? This is an important question, and as you travel around the world and meet people from different cultures, think about it and ask yourself this question. Um, for most of our existence, at least as agriculturalists, this kind of, and I'm using the term pre-modern and modern in a way some people might find offensive, but it comes from sociology in the 1960s. There's a seminal book in sociology that says becoming modern. And what sociologists meant was that not that modern people drive cars and use computers, but what they were separating in terms of modern and pre-modern is one's mindset. According to this sociological theory, people for most, at least of our agricultural history, didn't really have to think about who they were. Your identity was given to you at birth. If you were a serf or a peasant, you were born into that class. That was your identity, plus your religion. You were, let's say, a Catholic serf. Um, you didn't have to think about who you were. Your identity was pretty much laid out for you. You were going to probably live and die. You're going to probably die not far away from where you were born. Your entire life be lived out in a very small area. There weren't a lot of questions about like who you are. What sociologists say distinguish the pre-modern from the modern era is that we have an enormous amount of freedom in the modern era to construct our own biographies. Especially in a democracy, that freedom grows even greater. The success of this model, though, requires a great deal of individual responsibility. There's a famous German author who will mention two different, writer of two books that are relevant for this particular lecture. His name is Erich Fromm, and he wrote one of his famous books. He's writing after World War II, trying to explain the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe. One of the books he wrote is called Escape from Freedom. According to Fromm, most people don't want this degree of freedom. They don't want to construct their own identity. That unleashes a lot of insecurity. People, he argues, want to fit in. We're basically group animals. We like to feel like we're part of groups, not like we're this atom bouncing around that's unique. We really, most of us have this strong desire to fit in. And if you look at that, humans find all these different ways around which to build identities. Some of them are rather trivial and harmless, like passionate support of a sports team, where you can break down in tears because your team lost, even though you don't really know the players. You just so strongly identify with that particular team. We can construct our identities around the types of clothes we wear, the types of car we drive, our political affiliation, and these identities can be either banal, sometimes they can be positive, sometimes they can be very harmful. Um, Benjamin Barber, a very renowned social scientist, wrote a book called Jihad versus McWorld. And what he meant by jihad wasn't necessarily, he wasn't referring to Islam. He's referring to traditional culture, kind of pre-modern values, fighting back against what he sees as the values of consumer culture, which he calls McWorld. So two things happen with this incredible explosion in individual freedom that are negative. One is consumer culture partially steps into the vacuum, as I mentioned. People begin to build their identity around where they shop, where they eat, what kind of clothes they wear, what kind of car they drive, and there are large numbers of magazines like Cosmopolitan, GQ, that basically try to serve up a package identity based around things like style, fashion, the things that you buy as a consumer. The other side of this, the kind of pull towards a nostalgic past to some regards, are the isms. religious extremism that looks back towards a golden age, nationalism, populism, and other negative backlashes against consumer culture and modern life. Barber made the argument that democracy in the modern world is being squeezed between kind of the vacuous consumer culture where people, all they care about is living in the moment, and they relegate collective projects like environmental protection, erasing poverty to the margins. And on the other hand, it's kind of nostalgia for some mythical past that never, perfect past that never really existed. And this kind of desire for some kind of mythical past, what it does is it breeds a lot of intolerance, hatred, and kind of contempt for democratic institutions. So Barber's hypothesis is that we live in a troubled time where democracies are going to struggle to survive. Now, a little more detailed, discounting the future. Humans do not discount the future in any homogeneous way. Can't say that humans will think about the future in X way. Culture does have a lot to do with it. Also, the state of our well-being has a lot to do with it. Immediate deprivation can naturally cause people to fixate on the present. But it's not only the very poor that fixate on the present. Things like savings rates are a good indicator of concern for the future. And if you look at the United States, in the early 1970s, the average American family of 4 people had one person working, and they managed to save 11% of their income. If you fast forward to 2008, the so-called family of 4 now has 2 adults working, and they were unable to really save anything. Most families were in the negative. Some of this is because key prices had gone up, but also some of it is just strong discounting of the future and lack of discipline to squirrel away money. In our current world, you can see a difference between 2 cultures, China and the United States. In China, per capita income is still much lower than in the United States, but China has a much higher savings rate than the US. One thing we can say is that excessive exposure to commercial images may lead individuals to discount the future more. Okay, I want to now talk about some of the characteristics of consumer culture that affect the way we discount the future and the way we look at things like the environment. Consumer culture is something we don't think about, but when we talk about the big upheavals of the 20th century, we think about fascism, communism. Few people think about consumer culture, but consumer culture in the 20th century was a revolution in itself. One of the things it did was it kind of replaced notions that society traditionally had about how to become happy. The idea before the 20th century is that happiness comes from the social elements of life, your friends, your family. Consumer culture says that happiness comes through the marketplace, through the consumption of objects. And if you want people who are very buy into this, you want to understand why, for example, people, even wealthy people, object to paying taxes. Taxes, if you think happiness comes through the marketplace, taxes are taking away part of your potential happiness. Consumer culture also nurtures hyper-individualism because what it's always telling you, what counts is your own personal satisfaction in the moment. So if shopping makes you happy, go ahead and shop till you drop. Don't worry about the future. Don't worry, again, also about collective needs. Consumer culture is all about the needs of the individual, more or less in the moment, or at least the not so distant future. And this emphasis on short-term thinking can paralyze our ability to act collectively to do things that are needed on a longer-term basis, whether it's investment in R&D, or whether it's protecting the environment, whether it's investing more in a better education system. short-term thinking can lead to costly decisions in terms of their impact on the long run. And that goes along with this point that short-term horizons undermine long-term investment at the individual and societal level. If all you care about is the moment, you're not going to save for the future. You're not going to invest in yourself very much from a long-term perspective. And the same thing with the societal level. You're going to spend very little on discretionary things like research and development, education, public goods. These things take too long to bear fruits. Focusing too much on the individual relegates collective issues to the margins of our consciousness, things like civil rights, environment, poverty. These kind of issues there's not a lot of space left in our brain if all we're thinking about is our immediate happiness. Finally, when you see The Lost Children of Rockdale County, I want you to, this is really, you'll wonder where this film fits in our class. You're going to see this later on in the semester when we do urban planning. Partly it's about bad urban planning, but partly it's about the really negative impacts of consumer culture. And you can see in this documentary how consumer culture shaping home life, identity, relationships, and how people live their lifestyle. Consumer goods provide a symbolic language. Many use consumer goods to communicate identity, social status, sense of belonging, your community, your tribe. Think about even choice of cars. Increasingly can give you an idea of what political party someone adheres to. Consumer goods can even, to some degree, reflect one's purpose in life. So we've talked about destructive identities. Tribalism increasingly is being hijacked as a political weapon, and identities are being weaponized. So how does this relate to the environment again? Believing that climate change is real is seen by many as a betrayal of one's tribe. I had the good opportunity one time of sitting at a table with some very educated Republicans. One was an elected official at a fairly high level, and two were donors. And they all believed in climate change, and they were reflecting on how it's just suicide to normally say that in Republican circles. It's the equivalent of being in frat circle at a party wearing a Duke t-shirt. You're become kind of ostracized. So tribalism is a very powerful tool, and it can force people to take stands they often don't really deeply believe in. Several trends of the past 60 years. So we're going to look now at a little bit about why humans are also somewhat constrained in their ability to tackle, again, these types of collective issues like the environment. Anxiety and depression are going up as, interestingly, confidence is also going up. We'll look at this in a little more detail. Actually, let me bridge this now, and that deeper research showed that there are two types of confidence that if you don't structure your questionnaires enough, you don't get at this. There are people who have a good sense of who they are, their strengths, their weaknesses, able to withstand criticism. This is a good kind of confidence. But what they found is that the kind of confidence that's really going up is a very shallow sense of confidence where you try to puff yourself up. You're unable to take criticism. You often lash out at people. You build up your confidence by looking down on other groups, whether this is by categories of race or gender. This kind of confidence is what's been going up, and it's not a very good thing. So that explains why you can have anxiety and depression going up. in society at the same time while confidence is going up. Um, what researchers have also found is that when you compare previous generations, we're becoming more self-conscious, obsessed with how we appear to others, worried that others might find us unattractive, nerdy, boring, stupid, etc. And this naturally then feeds into the third point that narcissism is on the rise. So psychologists are always doing tests, especially with university students, where you can get some sum of money if you volunteer to take part in a test. So a lot of this data comes from studies done on college students. A few causes. High pressure to succeed. This might, talking about causes about why anxiety might be going up. We now live almost in a global marketplace for talent. This increased competition drives higher pressure. The world increasingly, to many, seems scary and threatening. Again, this might come a lot from the economic side of what's going on. If you think about your parents' generation, your parents basically were told all you needed to do was get a college degree, and that was a ticket to middle to up, at least an up, and probably an upper middle class life. Today, many people don't think that's enough. We live in a country now for the first time where the bulk of people growing up can expect not to exceed the earnings, the lifestyle of their parents. So this is making the world, one of the things that's making the world seem scary and threatening. Social media, today's teens spend an average of 9 hours a day online. A lot of that is on social media. Sometimes people aren't even cognizant of how much time they spend on social media. They may be doing an assignment that requires them to be on the computer, but they're bouncing back and forth between social media, so that 1 hour assignment now has grown into a 3 hour assignment because they couldn't focus. So social media stirs anxiety up because it has become a new source of determining status. How many likes you get on a post has a big impact on how you perceive and others perceive your status. Actually want to say one more thing about social media. I take students every spring break on a trip to the Caribbean to study coral reefs. And before there were two hurricanes in 2018, our destination was usually St. John on the American British Islands. And St. John is surrounded by the British Virgin Islands, so students would be, now there's cheap international plans, but back then people were afraid of big roaming fees. So most people would keep their phone off for most of the time they were there, except to call their parents, and then they would have to accept that they were making an international call because the reception was all coming from the British Virgin Islands. As soon as students would get back to Miami on the plane would land, I would see the students around me turn on their phone. And it really struck me one year. I was looking at how people were just zooming through their feed and just liking things without even spending a millisecond on exactly absorbing what they were seeing. And a lot of it was just stupid photos, like some people on the beach flashing gang signals. And that's when I realized that how destructive this time sink was. It wasn't that they really cared about what they were doing. They were just liking people's stupid posts so that people would reciprocate. This time sink is just all about reciprocation and a way for people to feel, to hold up their social status. And it affects the environment on many different levels. I was one time asked by students at lunch, we were talking about how environmental activism at UNC had just fallen off a cliff after 2008. And they were asking me about why I thought this was the case. And again, this was the first time it dawned on me. I mean, my first reaction was the Great Recession, that students became afraid to engage in leadership around activism, that in an era where it's very hard to get a job after graduation, this could hurt you. I thought the recession was part of it, but then I thought this is also when social media became quite prevalent. And I said, I bet social media has something to do with it. Said if students are spending an average of an hour a day on social media, something has to give. So working on social issues is going to take a back seat. And there were about 8 or 9 students there, and they all laughed at me and they said, it's not an hour a day. It's closer to 3 hours a day. So I would maintain that the rise of social media, you can see at UNC in terms of the amount of time and energy students have put into trying to tackle collective issues like the environment, like poverty, that after 2008, the amount of energy going into these issues just falls off a cliff. All right, I want to talk about some more of the reasons why social anxiety has increased so much over the last half century. Um, One is we live in, and especially in the US, but in many other places too, we live in a different world, and that people's knowledge of neighbors tends to be very superficial or non-existent. If you go back, talk to your grandparents, it's probably likely that your grandparents spent a lot of time in one place, were well rooted there, had knew their friends really well and their children, and their children knew their children of friends. There were people really knew what was going on in their town. Most people lived in smaller towns. Um, that world is gone. Today, many people live in environments where they don't know their neighbors or have very superficial kind of understanding about who they live next to. And in many exurban communities, people talk about their neighbors in terms of the quality of their lawn. Uh, so today, people often lack real knowledge of each other. Um, Therefore, increasingly, we live in this sea of anonymity where we're bumping up against strangers all the time, whether that's in the real world or on. In this world where we're bumping up against strangers all the time, um, who we are and how people are perceiving us is open to constant question. Instead of being confident because we know the people around us and they know us and whether we're having a bad hair day isn't going to affect their judgment of us. When you live in a world where you're constantly running into people for maybe the first and only time, people become a lot more obsessed with what others might think of them. And this is what psychology calls the social evaluative threat. As we start to interact more and more with strangers through either the grocery store or through online platforms, the power of the social evaluative threat tends to rise. So what is this? It comes from the fact that we're hardwired to seek higher status. And what has been shown is that, today when you take away real physical threats to our well-being, the greatest threat in terms of how we react psychologically is a threat to our social self and how we fit in the pecking order. Things that affect our sense of self-esteem or status tend to elicit a real reaction. So a threat to one's social self is a stressor that is the equivalent today of coming face to face with a large predator in the past. We react oddly in the very same way. We react using the fight or flight hormone, which is cortisol. So when someone threatens our status by making us feel um, little, making us feel ugly or dumb or not cool, we react by releasing cortisol, just as we would have 10,000 years ago if we were confronted with a giant hyena. Now, when you're confronted with a giant hyena, that's a good thing. When you're releasing cortisol because something you posted didn't get a lot of likes, or people made some snide comments about something you posted and you've been ridiculed, releasing cortisol then is a bad thing. It tends to build up anxiety, it tends to build up inflammation in our body, and it can hurt us psychologically and physically. Releasing a lot of cortisol can really begin, and doing so frequently can start to physically erode away at our health. So there are three types of stress with the greatest impact on our health. One is low social status, and that's where social media comes in. Lack of friends. Um, again, the world we are building makes it harder and harder to acquire and to keep friends. In that, we have fewer and fewer opportunities for true face-to-face time. And stress in early life also plays a role. So again, if you're a young kid and you're outcast by your peers, or you feel that way, your home life is stressful, your parents are fighting, they're divorced, all these things will impact on our health. It's stress causing a degradation of our physical, mental well-being. And as I mentioned already, in experiments with volunteers, the type of threats that provoke the largest cortisol response were those that involved a social evaluative threat, people commenting negative on you. So social media tends to increase the potential of this threat. It's also, as people become so obsessed with building status through social media, it's a powerful time sink that ironically can constrain individual potential and development. If you're spending 3 hours a day on this, something is falling by the wayside. If you're a teenager and you're on social media 2 or 3 in the morning, it's affecting your ability to learn in school. So there are many negative feedbacks that come from this new way of constructing status. I've also mentioned that it reduces our ability to engage in collective causes. You have a limited time, and if people commit 3 hours a day to this, something else is not getting time. And we'll talk about this at the end. I'm going to ask you to watch a video. And online consumer culture is allowing for the development of big data persuasion architectures that can be used for political purposes. For example, also to persuade large numbers of people that vaccines are bad or that climate change is a hoax. We'll look at persuasion architectures at the end of this lecture. All right. Now we want to look at a related topic, materialism, the cost of having a high materialistic value orientation. This also detracts from our ability to protect the environment. Now, I first want to mention that we're all materialistic, but some psychologists have begun to develop tests that kind of distinguish people who are kind of your routine level of materialistic value versus people who are just totally driven by materialism, shop to get happy. And what's interesting is that people like Tim Kasser, Ryan, the Cohens, I'm forgetting first names here, but been doing really interesting research in this area, have found that this is very bad for our having a high MDO is very bad for our mental well-being, and also, of course, leads to excessive consumption, which is bad for the environment and our environmental and carbon footprints. Now, it's important to understand the negative part of this, because one of the things that we've talked about and we will talk about more is that to bring about true change, you can't just ask people to not do something because it's bad. Don't drive because it's bad for climate change. You've got to provide people with a more attractive alternative. If people understood obsessing over consumption was bad, maybe we could shift people towards something else. So again, what is it? And an interesting work by that German that I mentioned earlier, Eric Fromm, also wrote a very relevant book called To Have versus To Be, where he mentions that people can live in one mode or the other. So living in a to have mode, take something like music. It's where you adapt your music taste to try to just listen to what's popular because you want to fit in. You don't really identify that much with it, but you stick with it, hoping that you'll make it. Your taste will grow around it. Living into a B mode is maybe loading up your playlist with things that other people might find odd or out of touch, old fashioned, whatever, but you're doing it because you don't care what others think about that. You're doing it because that's what appeals to you. Um, so people with high MVOs tend to really buy into this notion that happiness comes from the marketplace, and when they feel anxious, sad, they go online and shop or drive to the mall. Really believe that purchasing things is going, a pair of new shoes, a new car is going to make them feel happy. People with high MVOs tend to be very envious too of others who have more resources. So in terms of why is it harmful, people who have test for very high MVOs tend to have low sense of self-acceptance. They tend to have a weaker affiliation with their community. They tend to be, have weaker, fewer friendships, tend to be less embedded in their community life. Generally, they have a lower quality of life, stemming from what's mentioned. They have decreased quality of relationships with other human beings. And the really then negative thing, which people like Kasser and Ryan have been finding out, that this is a powerful force that leads to the prevalence of depression and anxiety. Because in a way it's a trap. If you believe that a pair of shoes will make you happy, they'll do that for a few hours, maybe a few days, but the power of those shoes to make you happy, or the Air Jordans, is going to quickly go away. So it's kind of a false path towards happiness. In college students, it's been found that students who test high on the materialistic value scale are more likely to be narcissistic, are likely to engage in things like drug use, have low self-esteem, be at risk for a variety of personality disorders, and interestingly, high MVOs also links to promiscuity. So how do people develop high materialistic value orientations? One is through socialization. Your parents are very materialistic. You watch lots of media with lots of advertising, and there have been studies, we don't think about it, but in an average day, an American can be exposed to thousands of commercial images a day. So either through internalization or modeling what you see around you, that's one way to develop a high materialistic value orientation. The other way, and what's really interesting, is through insecurity. And it's not just insecurity that you don't have resources, so you drive an old car, or your clothes are not the hottest fashion. It's a wide range of insecurities actually that can point people towards being rabid consumers. It can be economic insecurity. It can be feeling insecure about your physical well-being. For example, you perceive crime to be really high. Now that's another topic, but interestingly, while crime has been going down for decades, Americans have tended to perceive crime as a bigger threat than when it was actually much higher than it is today. All of these sources of insecurity can push us towards increasing our materialistic value orientation. Uh, so I mentioned Casser and Ryan, the Cohens. When I started teaching this course, I went to colleagues in the psych department, and I was looking for readings on this topic. I had read Eric Fromm's To Have versus To Be, and I thought this was an important topic that belonged in an environmental class. And I spoke to various faculty members there, and they all said, "Oh yes, you should read Eric Fromm." And I said, "I've done that. Can you recommend anything else?" And nobody had anything else to recommend. But little did they know, and did I know, that while I was building this course, there were a series of people around the country who were actually, after 50 years, that's how long ago Fromm wrote about this topic, were finding this topic all of a sudden very interesting again. Uh, so Casser and Ryan are two that have done a lot of research on this. They found that high MVOs really affect our ability to get along with one another. First, if you have a high MVO, you place less importance on values such as affiliation. You also tend to see humans and human relationships as disposable. So think in terms of a trophy wife, making well-connected friends in order to use them to get ahead. People tend to be treated in a more objectifying manner. People with high MVOs have less empathy than people with low MVOs. This again is important tackling collective issues. If you have a lot of people with high MVOs, they probably will lack the empathy to use their votes to steer society in a way that can tackle collective issues. People with high MVOs also score very high in tests of Machiavellianism, or in other words, they tend to be very manipulative. And in terms of even when they have friends, they're more likely to compete rather than cooperate. Interestingly, people with high MVOs have less autonomy. They're focused less on what they get from their choices than attaining rewards. When you see The Lost Children of Rockdale County, think about what's motivating these high school kids. There's especially one character, Amy, who really kind of fits in this description of the damage that high MVOs can do. She does things not because she identifies with them, but because she doesn't want to be cast out. She hates what the choices she makes, but she feels like she has no choice. This is kind of typical of someone with a high MVO. People with high MVOs do things, pursue goals because they feel guilty and under external pressure than because they identify with what they're doing. And people with high MVOs usually focus more on rewards than on the inherent fun of the activities in which they're engaged. And people who are just chasing rewards, for example, studying to be a dentist, not because they love teeth, but because their parents told them they can make money and play golf, tend to often be less motivated about what they're doing. People with high MVOs tend to also have low sense of competence, of well-being. Mentioned how there tends to be more narcissism. This is a product of an unstable sense of self-esteem, and it's that second type of confidence we mentioned earlier that's fragile, easily damaged, where people, when their self-confidence is poked, respond with aggression, violence. Often, again, people with low sense of self-esteem often try to compensate by hating some other group. It could be by becoming a racist, a misogynist, um, despising some other religion. Um, People with high MVOs are extremely obsessed with social comparisons and the opinions of others. And the sad thing is that the successful pursuit of materialistic goals does little to improve happiness and well-being. So we've talked about narcissism, um, and unfortunately, we're seeing a big rise in narcissism, uh, including our ability to tolerate it in society. Some of the things about materialistic, having high MVOs, we mentioned that not only bad for the environment because they cajole us in an unsustainable direction towards buying lots of stuff, but they also erode away social capital and do harm to individuals. Um, a question for you to think for our discussion, put this on the discussion page too, is how do we fight high MVOs and challenge a modern society that push individuals away from a more sustainable future, right? Want to look at something that will help give us some answers. Ronald Engelhard is an amazing researcher at the University of Michigan. He's been publishing work almost from the time I was a baby, and he's still going. He was just in the news a few weeks ago talking about some polling he's done and research on the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, Engelhard, all the way back in the early 1970s, came up with a theory about post-materialistic values. So for a while now, his research group, again, this is in the early 70s, and this guy's still doing research. His group had been collecting data from around the world about how people looked at different issues. And what Engelhard found was that as societies developed a broad, secure middle class, people started to look beyond basic materialistic values. What this means is looking beyond being concerned only with the well-being of their family, the bread and butter issues. And that as people became more secure, they started to care more about collective issues like civil rights, peace, the environment. And as he did polling around the world, he showed that as countries achieved a certain level of affluence and security that was broadly shared, you could see how values and changed and how that was reflected in policy and political decision making. Where that fits in today is that we mentioned that the 70s was the decade of the environment in the US. This is also the peak of the Great Compression. Today, as especially economic security, but all sorts of insecurity are rising in the US, it's no big surprise that things like environmental protection have not fared very well in recent years in the US. In Europe, where especially in countries like Germany and the Nordic countries, where there's still much greater sense of security among a broader middle class, that has a lot to explain why some of these countries are doing much better on sustainability than we are. His post-material value hypothesis also fits in very well with our view of sustainability that we've been discussing, that the way to create a more sustainable society is not to focus on one of these pillars at a time, but to think holistically and think about policies that are good for the economy, good for society, don't create incredible inequality, but create lots of good mid-paid jobs for people, and that are also good for the environment. That this type of holistic thinking is needed to nudge us towards sustainability. All right, I'd like for you to watch this TED Talk. It's by actually a UNC faculty member who's quite a rock star. She also writes for the New York Times, and she lectures about, in this TED Talk, about the dangers of persuasion architectures. And this is a topic that I think few of you have talked about. I'd like for you to watch this, and then that relates to the questions that we'll be discussing in the next class. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture, and have a good day.